The Compromise of 1877. The year 1876 was an election year. Democrat Samuel Tilden and the Republican challenger, Rutherford B. Hayes, were the presidential candidates. 3 years earlier, in 1873, the Panic of 1873, a serious depression, had hit the nation. Voters turned against the Republicans, blaming them for the economic downturn. And in the congressional elections of 1874, Democrats won dozens of seats in the House, giving them a congressional majority. A similar scenario played out in the presidential race of 1876. Prior to this time in American history, there had never been a really close electoral college vote. But this year, it was different.
What happens in 1876 is that the election is very close. In fact, the vote is so close that the change of just a few electors in just a few states would throw the election one way or the other.
Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but Rutherford B. Hayes won the more important electoral college vote, although by only one vote.
The Democrats thought it was pretty clear that they had won the election, but the Republicans became convinced, actually not on election night, but increasingly in the next few days, that it wasn't clear that a fair election had been held in Louisiana or in Florida especially. And indeed, there were still federal troops in Louisiana, still somewhat extensively. And Florida was just in the process of transition from Republican to Democratic control.
The parallels to the Bush-Gore presidential election of the year 2000 are fascinating.
Florida's involvement is kind of ironic because the next great crisis of the Electoral College in the year 2000 involves the state of Florida and involves a sort of unnerving set of parallels in which the Secretary of State is in one party, the legislature is in the hand of the other party, and the Attorney General is in the different hands than the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General and the Secretary of State are on opposite sides. And it's exactly replicated in the year 2000.
To defuse the crisis, the Republicans made a deal with the Democrats called the Compromise of 1877.
And the compromise is to set up a special electoral commission to hear evidence and determine the electoral votes.
There's a bit of controversy on how the matter was settled.
Now, historians will say the real action happened outside of the commission, that in fact a deal was cut to allow the Republican candidate to be elected, provided that what the Democrats most wanted was achieved, namely that Reconstruction was ended, that federal troops would be removed from the southern states. Modern historians have challenged that notion of a deal cut outside, if only because by 1876 there were relatively few federal troops still in the South. I mean, effectively, they controlled a few blocks in New Orleans by March of 1877, or late February 1877, when the election is getting determined. So it's not clear that anything could have been done to stop the end of military Reconstruction in the South.
In any case, federal troops were removed from the southern states, and the Reconstruction governments promptly weakened and fell. The South was now returned to its pre-Reconstruction status, and as a result, the suffering of Southern African Americans was far from over. To make matters worse, in 1883, the United States Supreme Court declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional.
The act seems straightforward enough, but in 1883 the Supreme Court struck it. They struck particularly the enforcement provision arguing that the 14th Amendment only encompassed public discrimination, not private. In other words, only those things that were involved with the state, which they call state action.
This decision, in essence, made segregation legal. The era of Jim Crow in the South had begun. The goal of white supremacists was to keep African Americans oppressed, uneducated, impoverished, and segregated from white society.